All right, go ahead and share my screen. This will be a fairly brief meeting, I think, just because there's only so many hooks to talk about. But ideally, it would be a conversation. So if I talk about anything that you have questions about or want further explanation on, or just want to talk about specific use cases or anything like that, please feel free to jump in and ask at any point in time. And I'd be happy to talk about it. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. It's the first part of every meeting. All right. So let's dive right in. All right. So I'm assuming most of you that have joined this probably know what hooks are, probably have worked with React a little bit, at least. But just to get everyone on the same footing, in case that isn't the case, let's talk about what hooks are. So hooks were introduced to React a few years ago, and they made functional components in React much more viable, and they also basically eliminated the need to use class-based components. So what they do is allow you to use state values in React functional components. It also just simplifies the syntax of creating state compared to class-based components, and just makes state easier to work with. It also allows some of these hooks allow us to control UI updates and value changes more granularly, such as use effect, use memo, etc. And it's a fantastic abstraction tool via custom hooks. And custom hooks are simply hooks that you can define yourself that utilize React's built-in hooks. So, yeah, and in my opinion, they're the future of React. So functional components and hooks, it's kind of where React is headed. If you're starting a new React project, there's essentially no reason to use class-based components anymore. And I would recommend against doing that. Okay, so these are the hooks we're going to be talking about today. We have use state, use effect, use context, use reducer, use ref, use callback, and use memo. Some of these are far more commonly used than others, but just want to touch on all of them so that you're at least aware that they exist, so that if you come across a use case and while you're working with a React project, you can potentially recall this knowledge and utilize it in a productive way. So let's just briefly, I want to briefly touch on each one and kind of go over what they're used for, and then I will kind of dive more into each one and show examples, show some code, and I'll probably show some examples from Court, it's a project for TechShare, for those of you not aware of that, that I've been working on. All right, so use state is the most commonly used hook. It's what creates state values, and state values, for those of you that aren't aware, in React, when they're updated, they cause the UI to re-render. So any component that utilizes a state value will get re-rendered when that state value changes. That's kind of the fundamental way React works. And then we have use effect. And use effect essentially replaces the lifecycle functions, I guess, from class-based components, and allows us to run specific pieces of code only when we want to. So we can have code run dependent on a specific state value or a set of state values if it calls for that. We have use context. I've talked about context before a couple of times. If you're not aware, context is a built-in React API that is used to essentially avoid what is called prop drilling, where you're passing props and handlers down through several layers of components. And it can get really hairy and difficult to debug, difficult to clean up. It's not very readable. And so that's where context comes in. It allows you to wrap a set of components in a context provider and create shared state for all of those components to use without having to prop drill. And so use context basically exposes that API and allows us to use any context that we create.
So the state inside context is like global, or
potentially it depends. I mean, it's context, right? So it's contextual. So you can use it for global state. The thing about context is that it's not really a state management solution similar to something like Redux. If you've worked with Redux before, because it doesn't only re-render the components that use particular pieces of state. It actually renders everything under the provider when any of the state in that provider changes. So using it as global state can be dangerous if the values in your global provider are going to change a lot, because it's going to re-render everything in your application, right? Every time that state changes, which can get costly if you have a complex UI or complex state. Does that make sense?
yeah, perfect.
Cool. So, oh, whoops, how do I go back? Okay, let's get back into this. Sorry. All right. Yeah, so I would recommend using contexts in smaller fragments where it's necessary. And if you need global state that gets updated a lot, I would look into using something like Redux. Maybe not. There's a lot of state management solutions out there. I won't go into too much detail on that because that's not necessarily what this talk is for. But okay. So let's use context. Use reducer is oftentimes used alongside use context, but essentially it splits complex state update logic into more readable chunks. And if you've worked with Redux, you've worked with reducers and that style of updating complex state. But basically it's a switch statement where you're sending basically update commands for specific pieces of state, and then all of that update logic is in one spot. Makes it easy to find and update as opposed to having it all in one giant block or something. And then we have use ref. So these last three, I will say, are the least commonly used hooks in my experience. Yeah, they're just not used nearly as often as the other ones, but there are fringe cases where they can be useful. Use ref allows you to create a mutable object or value that keeps its value across re-renders. So this is not a state value that you create using use ref. When it's updated, it doesn't cause re-renders. So the most common use case for use ref is for basically accessing the DOM directly, or like a specific div or some part of the DOM that you can call functions on or manipulate directly. That's what I've used it for more often than not. But it can be used to basically create a normal JavaScript object that isn't affected by React's re-renders if that's necessary. Then we have use callback and use memo. These kind of fall under the same umbrella. Use callback is for functions, so it's for creating functions that work similar to the way that use effect does. Use effect utilizes something called a dependency array, which is an array that you pass in that you populate with certain state values that you want to call that piece of code whenever they change. So use callback and use memo works similar to that. They'll use a dependency array, but it's for creating a function that only gets updated when values in that dependency array change. That's use callback. Use memos for creating objects that only get updated when certain state values change. These are kind of optimization techniques. Usually, if you have an expensive piece of code or like a function that's for whatever reason extremely complex and costly to recreate every time a component re-renders, you can use callback and basically say, I only want this function to get recreated anytime this state value or set of state values updates. Does that make sense to everyone? And I'll talk more about that in a bit when I go into examples and things. Cool.
That makes sense.
Good.
All right. So now that we've kind of briefly gone over all of the hooks, or not, these are not all of them to be fair, but the other ones I have never touched in my life. I don't really feel qualified to talk about their use cases because I've never found a use case for them. Yeah, in my opinion, it would be extremely, extremely rare for you to actually need them. Okay. So let's talk about use state and use effect really quick. So use state, most of you are, again, probably familiar with. You can create state values with it and use it to update the UI. So let me just show some code. Okay. Is that large enough for everyone? Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay. So you can see here we're creating some state values. One is a number, the other is a Boolean value. And we have buttons that call the set function that gets returned from that use state hook. Use state, by the way, returns an array of two values, one being the state value itself, and the second being an update function. It's important that whenever you update a state value, you're not manipulating it directly, like doing count equals whatever, something like that, because that will not persist across re-renders. Whereas using the set function that comes along with the return value will, and it will update the UI. So these are not normal values that you can just, normal JavaScript values that you can just update willy-nilly. You need to use that function that comes along with it. And that's what tells React to re-render the UI. So yeah, we have just an increment function, and in that that update function that comes back, you can also access the previous value of that state value. And this is necessary for like if you're updating a state value consecutively, like more than once, if you don't do it this way where you're using the previous state value, then it's not going to work the way you expect. So for instance, let's if we did this and instead of doing this, let's just say we do count +1, which looks like a normal use case. It looks like how intuitively that's what you would do. But let's say you do this twice in a row, you would expect it to then be updated twice, but it doesn't work that way. As you can see, we're only getting one update there, and really it should be going up by 2 now because we have 2 sets in there. And the reason this doesn't work is because of how React kind of handles these updates in the background. It queues them up. And so when you're calling this twice, count is 0 both times you're calling this. So you're just setting count to 1 twice instead of setting count to 1 and then setting count to 2. If you want something like this to work, you have to access the previous value within the function and use that to update it, because this will then queue up these changes so that it's going to use that previous value. So now when we update this, it's going to be, it starts at 0, we go up 1, and then this one will access that new value of 1 and update it again to 2. So now if we increment it, it will go up by 2. Make sense? Still in the fairly basic territory. You probably encountered examples like this in tutorials if you've ever done React tutorials. Very common example.
I have a question.
Yes.
The variable previous count is defined, or is it a system variable?
So yeah, you're just passing in a function. This could be called anything you want it to be. Yeah, you could call it P if you wanted to, but like, yeah, it's just a function that is expecting that takes in that previous value. So you can name that variable whatever you want.
Okay, got it.
Okay. So let's talk about use effect. Okay. So this is how we use effect. Use effect is going to take in a function that again will run whenever anything in this dependency array changes. So right now we're going to do an alert every time this is on Boolean value changes. So if we go back to our screen, if we update this count, it's not going to alert us. We have, oh, hold on, didn't save the file. And use effect will always run the first time a component is loaded as well, or rendered rather. So, and then it's only going to run whenever we hit that toggle or change that toggle value, because that's in our dependency array. If we add count to this dependency array, then it's going to be listening for changes on both of those values. And so now it should alert us anytime we update either of these. Yeah. So that's the dependency array. If you want a piece of code only to run when a component initially renders, then you'll just use an empty dependency array, and that will only run once and never again. So that can be useful for something like data fetching in a component. If you don't pass in a dependency array, this is just going to run every time the component re-renders. So you may as well not even use the use effect. If you're going to do this, you could just put this code right in the body of the component, because there's not really a need to use effect in that way.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I see that the use state starts with false value,
Yes.
but as soon as you refresh it, it pop-ups the alert.
Mm-hmm.
So it should pop up when it's true, doesn't it?
No, because we're not actually checking that condition. We're just checking if this value changes. So anything you put in that dependency array is it's not like adding any additional logic in there. If we did something like this, then yes, that would be true. So like if we did this, it's not going to run that first time. Refresh. Yeah. So if it starts and off, it's not going to run anymore, but we didn't have any condition
Any
like
condition.
that set up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions on use effect stuff?
Hey, Kai, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sometimes when I use effect with a function inside use effect,
Yes.
I think it's ESLint. ESLint asks me to add the function to the dependency array. But when
Mhm.
I do that,
Yeah.
I think it shows an error or another warning. So I end up not adding the function to the dependency array. What's your take on that? And
Yeah. Great question. Because I've also encountered this. So functions are going to get redefined. Let's say I add a function up here called, I don't know, do something. And we'll just console log. So if we add this into our dependency array, and let's say we're running this inside of our use effect. Wait. Right. Yeah, so this is actually even warning us about this. So this is going to get redefined every time this component re-renders. And so like if we were updating a state value inside of this, then this is going to get called over and over and over and over again. And it's going to cause an infinite re-render, which is a common issue in React. And that's because this every time this re-renders, we're causing a re-render by setting the state value. So it's going to re-render this component, and then this function will get redefined, which means that this function is changing. So this use effect will run again, and then we'll update the state. So it's just an infinite loop of re-renders. And the way to avoid this, honestly, the way that I avoid it is by ignoring the ESLint warning about adding functions into the use effect dependency array, which maybe isn't advisable, but in my opinion, more often than not, it's going to cause more problems than good. But the way to avoid this is by using that hook that we talked about previously, which is use callback. And so with this, I gotta import this, and passing in an empty dependency array so that this function only gets defined once. And so now this do something function will only get run once inside of this use effect because it's only getting defined on that first render. And it shouldn't cause any issues. Yeah. So you can either add a use callback, and if a function is dependent on some specific state value or something like that, then you'll want to add that into your dependency or the dependency array for that use callback. But if not, then, and you only want that function to get defined the first time a component renders, then you want to use callback with an empty dependency array. That makes sense, Rodolfo?
It does. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Anything else on use effect? It's kind of a big one. That's probably the second most used hook compared to use state. Okay. So if that's it for use effect. Oh, one more thing I want to cover with use effect is that inside of this function, you can also return a function, a cleanup function. And so this is usually to clean up anything you're like any async things like canceling async functions that happen within the use effect. And basically this cleanup function will only get called when this component is removed from the DOM. And so if you're, let's say, like adding an event listener or something to the page inside of this use effect, then you would want to remove that in this return function for the use effect. It's kind of a case-by-case basis thing. If you have things to clean up, then you want to use this. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, did somebody say something? No? Okay. All right. And then let's see. So talk about use effect. Let's talk about use context. Okay, so I have a simple example for use context. Let's show the code really quick. So React comes with all of these built-in functions to allow you to use context providers. The main ones being create context and use context. So this is in TypeScript, by the way. So if you're not familiar with TypeScript, some of the syntax may not be familiar to you. Essentially we're assigning a type to our context value or our state that's going to be shared in the context provider. But this is how we create a context, and then in order to use it, we just pass that into use context, and that gives us access to whatever values we set in that context provider. Yeah, so with that context, you can do .provider, and that's a React component that we can render around any set of components that we want to have access to this shared state. So in this case, it's just an object that contains number value and also this set function set number value. And so that allows us to use this value in any nested components. And so in this main component we have down here, we're rendering this provider, which is really just wrapping anything inside of this in that context provider with that state defined. So we're setting up state provider. We have a nested component. Within that nested component, we're using our context. We're grabbing that state, and we're setting up a button to update that number value in this nested component. And notice we don't have to use props to drill it down into these components. But inside of that, we have a deeper nesting component. And inside of that, we're rendering a simple consumer that's just going to render our number value. So we have something, a nested component that's updating that shared state, and a nested component that's consuming that shared state. And none of these have props. We don't need props on any of these. So it just makes it easier to read, easier to follow, because we have a centralized location for our state. And then let me just show the UI for this. Another thing I want to bring up, where is this? Oh, you know what? I don't have it installed on this version, but let me open it over here. If you, where is my, okay, so Chrome has this cool React Dev Tools extension. And what that does is it gives us, if it's decides to work, this, okay, yeah. In your inspect, it gives you access to 2 new tabs called Components and Profiler. Within Components, you can see all of your React components. Within Profiler, you can profile the performance of specific component renders and things like that. But there is also a really cool tool in here in settings. If you go to Profiler settings, and there's this checkbox called Highlight Updates when components render. This is really, really useful for debugging rendering issues with React. So I highly recommend using this if you're running into problems with components rendering when you don't want them to, or anything like that. And it'll just put a box around components whenever they update. So you can see it highlight everything. But okay, so I put together this small example for context. We have our context provider as our top level component here. Nested component, deeply nested component, and inside of our nested component, we have our increment button that's updating our context state. And then we have our consumer that's just displaying that number that we have in the state. And you can see that it's updating everything inside of the provider every time we hit this. So that's what I mean when I say that it's going to re-render everything inside of the provider anytime a state value changes, which is not the case for some of the more advanced, I guess, state management solutions in React. Okay, does that all make sense to everyone? To use context hook and context stuff?
Yeah.
Awesome. So that is super useful for cleaning up components. All right. So then we have use reducer, which, oh, whoops, I just opened OBS by accident. Use reducer. And for this, I'm going to show examples from Court. So this is an example of one of our context providers, multimodal provider, which handles, it houses all of our state for modals on a page and manages information that the modals need and things like that, and whether they're being shown, et cetera, et cetera. So inside of here, we have use reducer being used. So we have our provider, our context provider, and then we have this reducer where we are grabbing state that is returned from the reducer, and then a dispatch function that is used to send essentially commands to update pieces of the state. So this is what I mean by separating kind of the state update logic. So when if you have a large piece of state, like an object that has several layers or something like that, you're probably going to want to use reducer to separate that update logic. And here we're just passing in a reducer function that takes in our state, and we have types set up for all of the state. And then our action. An action is just going to be an object that has a payload and a type. And based on that type, that determines what kind of update we're going to run on the state. And yeah, so here we're just manipulating the state. And if there's complex logic, you'll probably want to set up separate functions for each of these switch case statements. So for example, here we have a fairly complex state update with like lots of nested updates going on. And so we separate that out and just pass in whatever we need. So we pass in this function that switches on the type of the action that we're performing. And then we're also passing in our initial state. And let me find an example of using the actual dispatch. So I have abstracted a lot of the logic out into custom hooks. So if we go in here, you can see where the dispatch function is being used. We are dispatching an object with a type and a payload. And that's what's used with that reducer to update the state. That all makes sense?
Kind of. I mean, it's kind of hard to
Follow.
to understand. Yeah, to follow that.
Yeah, it takes a little getting used to using these reducers. And really it only makes sense if your state is complex enough to warrant that separation. But essentially all you need to know is that you're going to set up different action types. So for example, like for setting this specific value on the state, we have an action for that. We have an action for setting a modal item. We have an action for toggling a modal. And then each of those payloads that comes along with that type, we define as well as these actions. And we're just taking that information and using it to update the state. So for instance, like with our update or set entity ID action, which would be this one, we're just returning the state with the updated entity ID, taking in that payload, which in this case will just be the entity ID, and we're returning that updated state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's significantly more complex than just like calling set state or like using use state. But it's useful for separating complex logic.
Hey, Kyle, another quick question.
Yes.
In your projects, in order to manage state, what do you usually use? Like more often, what do you use more often? Use a state, or do you use reducer, or do you use another packages to handle state?
So more often than not, I'm using. I mean, so for context state, that's typically where I'm using use reducer, because if I'm setting up a context provider, it's probably more.
All right, but outside of that, outside of the provider,
yeah, then I'm typically using use state for just like local state values, because in those cases, more often than not, it's fairly simple state updates. If it starts to get more complex, then abstracting it out to a reducer makes sense. But yeah, I would say in most cases outside of context, I'm using use state.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Okay, that's it for use reducer. Then we have use ref, which I talked about before, is more often than not used for manipulating the DOM directly. See if I opened anything for that. Yeah, so I mean, my example for this probably isn't the best, but you can at least see how it's used. So I have this pop-up component that's utilizing a pop-up component from another library, but is giving more granular control and cleaning up the API for it, since we only use it a certain number of ways. But inside of this, we need access to this wrapper for this pop-up. And so I'm creating this menu ref, just setting it to null initially. And then in this div, we can take, all divs are going to have this ref prop available to them. And you can use that to set the current value of this menu ref value. And all ref values created with this use ref hook are going to have this .current function, or not function, property that's going to contain the current value of that reference. And the way we're using that is inside of this other custom hook that takes in references to DOM elements and runs whenever we click outside of those elements. So in this case, this is being used to toggle this pop-up whenever we click outside of it, if that makes sense. So that's just one use case, but again, there's potential for it to be used in other ways. Like I believe there are other places we use it to track the initial render of things, because that doesn't need to be a state value. It makes sense for it to be a ref because we don't want it up like re-rendering our components when it's not actually being used in the UI. Let's see if I can find an example here. Another use case is oftentimes if you're using vanilla JavaScript libraries that aren't built for React, they will come with mutable objects that have like functions and properties that you can use on them. And so sometimes you'll need to use useref to access those and use it like normal JavaScript, essentially. That's another thing that it's been useful for. Yeah, so something like this, where we're using useEffect with an empty array, tracking if it's the first initial render, I guess. Yeah.
One thing that I've used ref for, I'm not sure if this is the best, but I've used it to scroll to specific elements in the page.
Yes, yeah, that's a great use case as well. Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't built anything for that, but actually there is something on Court that calls for that, so I will probably be using useref as well. But yeah, great example. Okay, and then use callback and use memo. We've kind of already touched on those, and like I told Rodolfo, use callback and potentially use memo could also be used to kind of control use effect for when you define functions that need to be in that use effect dependency array. I don't really have good examples in Court for these, I don't think. I mean, I guess here's an example of use memo. I'm basically creating a memoized version of another state value, but only dependent on specific values within that state, because those are the only values I care about changing. So when only those values change is when this will update, and then I'm using that inside of a use effect. So I guess that's one way it could be used. But again, these are optimization techniques more often than not, or they can be used to prevent infinite re-renders if you're running into issues with that. Okay. Any questions on those last two? All right. Oh, Robert.
I just wanted to ask if we could see a little bit more of the custom hooks.
Yeah. That's my last slide.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. I was about to get to that. So custom hooks. So let's talk about those really quick. So custom hooks are hooks that you define that utilize any combination of React's built-in hooks. And just some tips for creating custom hooks. Your custom hook should always start with the word use, just to indicate that we're using React's built-in hooks, and that these should only be used inside of React components, so that we don't get them confused with normal JavaScript functions. Even though they behave similarly to JavaScript functions, they're really only meant to be used inside of React components. And another thing is think carefully about the name parameters and return values. So in my experience, it makes sense to me for the return value. If there's only one return value, obviously you can just return that value. You don't need to wrap it in an object or an array. For 2 to 3 return values, mostly like 2, an array makes sense. But only if the first 1 or 2 are always used. So like if you look at use state, you have, your state value and then the setter for that state value. That makes sense to have an array, so that you can name those, that value and that setter, whatever you want. And then for more return values, objects typically make sense, because the more complicated your return value gets, you're not necessarily certain which return values are going to actually be used by the developer that's consuming that hook. And so you want to give them the freedom of accessing them in any order that they need. Yeah, and then lastly, custom hooks can utilize other custom hooks for endless abstraction, which is a lot of fun. You can build a lot of really cool tools this way. So I can talk about some of the custom hooks in Court now. We have a file called common hooks that contain a ton of different hooks for lots of different purposes. For example, we have this one, which sets up our API worker, which is an Axios object, and that's using our global state, which is the reason it needs to be a hook and not just a function. We have, yeah, I mean, the possibilities are endless. We have our data fetcher, which sets up everything that we can need for fetching data. Yeah, do people have specific questions about custom hooks, or yeah, Roberto, did you have something specific that you wanted to ask about?
Oh, well, not in a specific question, I just wanted to see like an example of how you use it. I mean, you have like a lot of them, but
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of hard to focus on any one.
just
but,
like an advice on how in what kind of situations you kind of use it
Sure.
more maybe.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say any situation where you are using the same kind of state in several different components, or you're finding that there are a lot of use cases for a specific state or state manipulation, things like that. You'll probably want to abstract that to a custom hook so that you can simplify and declutter your components, so that you're not having all of this logic in several places. It can be contained to one custom hook. One thing to note, I don't know if this is something that people get confused by or not, but if you define state in a custom hook and use it in several different components, it's not going to be the same state. It's going to define that state in two separate places, just to clarify on that. So it can't be used like context is used to like share state between components. If you define a custom hook with state in it, if you use that hook in more than one place, it's going to define two separate pieces of that state, if that makes sense. You can use hooks. So yeah, that's actually a good use case for custom hooks, is actually in our context providers once again. So I use custom hooks in here to simplify the kind of API that is used to update context state. So for example, like I have these context hooks, custom hooks set up to easily create these use provider contexts functions. So like for specific context providers, I'll define a function that will access that context for me without having to like provide the specific context value every time we use that. And so that just abstracts that logic out, makes it a lot easier to use because you don't have to worry about passing in any parameters, and like you would with vanilla use context, if that makes sense. So usually, I mean, it's oftentimes it's used for readability, but also for maintainability as well, just to keep common code in one place.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. I think that is about it for our talk on hooks. Any just general questions on anything I've covered that you've thought of?
I have one last question, Kyle.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on passing hooks as parameters? I mean, I've done it, but have you done that? Or
just hearing that for some reason made me cringe. I don't know why. I've never done that before. I've never thought of doing that, but for some
maybe I
reason,
should be more. Maybe I should be more specific. Sorry, passing state hooks. You know, the set something, that function.
That is fine if it is like one layer deep. I think if you're going further than that, then you want to set up a context instead. But if you just need to pass it to one component that needs to set some value or something like that, I think that's totally fine. I don't see a problem with that. And like that's a pretty common use case, I would think.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, no problem.
I have another question. What do you think is the best tutorial for React? I mean, is there a tutorial that you think is the best one? Or?
Oh man, that's tough because it's been a while since I've done or like watched React tutorials. So there's probably better ones by now, I would think. I have a lot of resources, like text resources, that I've kept fairly updated, just with articles that I found that cover a lot of specific topics. But as far as like guided tutorials go, I think actually, Rodolfo, you have a pretty good one, right? I think you may have linked one before when somebody was asking about it.
The Udemy course, that one, or which one?
Yeah. Is that do you think that's a solid one for learning modern
Yeah.
React?
Yeah, I'll send you the link, Danny.
Sure. Thank you.
Awesome.
Also, in the last video, the one that is in YouTube, I think you talk about some documentation that you will send over, but I think that video is, I don't know how old it is, but maybe that documentation, I don't know if you still have it. Can you share it?
We do. It probably needs to be updated because I have learned things since then, but I'm actually working on kind of a course or a guided course with lots of different resources for React and learning React that will be used in our like Simpats React learning program, essentially. So that is probably, I could send you that if you think that would be helpful. And that just contains links to a number of resources, but also kind of a guided assignment, just so that you can get your hands dirty if you're just starting out.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome. Any other questions before we go? I know it's 2 p.m., so I'm sure people are needing to go. If not, that's it for me. Thanks for listening. And if you think of any other questions, feel free to message me on Slack. And that goes for any React questions. I'd be happy to help out with. Yeah, so feel free to message me whenever. Yeah, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.